Hi, everyone. What a week and month and year so far. We are approaching the end of our school year, if you can believe it. And the very last unit that we were going to do is the evolution of populations, the theory of evolution, and evidence for evolution. Um, I obviously cannot do things the way I would love to do. Sorry. So I'm just going to kind of take you guys into this a little bit. You already saw a little bit of what evolution is and what that means. And we're going to talk about what that word really means because some people don't believe in evolution, but it's not really a belief, it's a scientific fact. And it's very compatible with religious thought. So if you are someone who is religious, this is not telling you that you can't be. And if you are someone who's not religious, same thing. It's not telling you that you can't be. It is completely separate. So the first thing I have in here is just a dance video called The Evolution of Dance Dance. And it's this guy who does like dancing throughout the decades. And um, I don't know, it was really popular on YouTube back in the day. You can watch that if you want. But maybe you recognize this guy from the X-Men thing stuff. I've never really seen that or been into it, but um, he's a mutant called Darwin, and his like ability is that he can adapt to survive. Now, this is kind of related to this whole idea of evolution, and you might have heard of Charles Darwin. But in the movie, mutations are mostly bad, which isn't always true. Sometimes we have mutations and they're good, or sometimes we have mutations and literally nothing happens. Mutations also can't just cause a whole new species to appear. It has to occur over time, which is something that you guys are going to see is a common theme here for evolution. So, when we talk about evolution, we're talking about populations. I'm an individual. I am one human being and I cannot evolve. It's not possible. I can change, I can evolve. What evolves then is populations, which are just groups of individuals of the same species that can interbreed with each other. And we have to be able to interbreed so that they could share genes. They can share a gene pool. So a lion and a zebra are not part of the same population because they cannot interbreed and therefore they can't share a gene pool. So we have to talk about groups of individuals of the same species. For example, a population of humans. That is a population, group of the same species. We can have babies with each other. Not that you should. What are these? They're caribou, okay, like reindeer. That's a population. One species, they could evolve over a long period of time. Do you guys know what this is? This is a liger. Okay. Now, are lions and tigers the same species then, since they can have babies? No, because ligers aren't really healthy. They don't live that long, and they're actually infertile. They can't have babies. So lions and tigers are still their own populations, and they could evolve. And when we talk about populations evolving, we don't mean that all of a sudden a lion looks like a lion that you guys know, and then 100 years from now it is purple and 80 feet tall. Like it doesn't have to be that extreme. Evolution can just be changes in allele frequency, and that essentially means how common an allele is in a population. So it could be a high frequency, which means it's really common, or it could be low frequency and it's less common, and those frequencies can change. And that's all that evolution really is. So if you've ever heard people say, oh, I don't like evolution, I don't believe in evolution, it contradicts like the things that I believe and yada yada, all evolution is really saying is that over time, allele frequencies will change in a population, meaning that how common an allele is going to change. So that could be something like blue eyes in humans or um, faster running speed in rabbits. It's totally varied on the situation, but if those allele frequencies change over time in a population, that is evolution. Okay, so we know that when we're talking about evolution, we're talking about two things so far. We're talking about a population that's going to evolve, and we're talking about how the allele frequencies in that population are going to change. So let's pretend we're talking about this population of mice, okay? 48% of this sample population is heterozygous for the black trait. meaning different, 16% is homozygous black, and 36% is homozygous brown. And let's imagine over a span of 10 years, this suddenly changed where 99% of the mice were homozygous brown. That would be an example of evolution happening because we're seeing a drastic change in that allele frequency. So if we were in class, I would ask you guys about what traits you have, and we'd see like how common things are, but we can't because we're not together. And then we would define evolution as this. Basically, evolution is a change in the allele frequency of a population that's going to eventually result in a new species developing from an existing species. So remember, this is not like a lion becomes this gigantic 80-foot beast that's purple. It's more like some change, like the mice. Brown became more common. So now this new species of mice is mostly brown, and they're different than the original species. So evolution is really just that change in allele frequency. It's not something crazy that's contradicting your beliefs. Any change in allele frequencies in a population that ultimately is going to result in a new species coming from an old one. So that's how we know if a population is evolving. If we look at the allele frequencies, we're able to tell if evolution is occurring. So if we were together, we'd play a game of telephone, but we can't. And then we look at this hunk of burning love. Woo! What a stud! Do you know who this is? This is the guy who came up with a lot of the basic tenets of the theory of evolution, of natural selection, basically. And his name is Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was this guy who came up with this terminology, this natural selection. This is basically how evolution occurs. Evolution is the change in allele frequencies. Natural selection is the process in which it happens. So how does evolution occur? How do allele frequencies change over time? Basically, certain alleles for certain traits are going to give you an advantage. That advantage helps you survive longer. And the longer you survive, what do you do more? You have more babies. That is not true for like people necessarily always. Sometimes people can be 80 years old and they have one kid, but for organisms, it's true. The longer you're alive, the more babies you're going to have. So natural selection is this process where some trait gives you an advantage. That advantage makes you live longer. And that longer livelihood makes you have more babies so that you pass on your genes more often. That's how evolution happens. That's natural selection. And you guys will hopefully get to do an online kind of activity with these moths, which is a great example of natural selection and evolution happening in a very actually short span of time. If you look at this picture, it might look like there's one moth right here. There's not. There's two moths in this picture. Moths. You see right here, look, there's the bottom of the wings, like the flat part, and it comes to a triangle. There are two moths in this picture, but one of them is much easier to be seen than the other one. Well, what would that do? How would that be an advantage to be this peppered moth over here? Well, back before the Industrial Revolution, these moths lived on trees that were kind of peppered in their bark because of the stuff that grew on them. So this moth over here was really easily hidden. That means if I'm a bird and I'm just like trying to get a snack real quick, I'm gonna swoop down and I'm gonna pick the one that I see, which is the black one. So black was actually much less common in this population than the white ones. But after the Industrial Revolution, what did we make from all of these factories and all the stuff that we were building? We made a lot of pollution. And what did the pollution do? Well, it turned the trees and the forest basically black from all the soot and the air pollution. So if you look here, this is what happened to the trees over time. That's not evolution. We did this. We made the trees black because of all the pollution. They didn't change genetically. But what tended to happen now is that if I'm a bird and I'm trying to get a quick snack, this peppered moth is easier for me to see. So instead of eating the black one more often, we eat the white one more often. And that means that the black moths became more and more and more common. So that was a change in allele frequency over time. That's evolution. How? Well, the black one in this situation now had an advantage. He lived longer. That means he had more babies, which means there became more black moths. That is natural selection. Okay, so here's a summary of what we just said. We know that evolution is the change in allele frequencies over time that's going to make a new species eventually result from an old species. One example of evolution that we have observed directly is the peppered moth. And now that the um, Industrial Revolution had happened, black moths had an advantage. They had an adaptation. They had some trait that made them more likely to survive and reproduce, and therefore they did. They became more common, and they change the allele frequencies. So how did evolution happen? That was that natural selection. One trait made them more likely to survive over time. So let's look at some more examples of adaptations, things that natural selection would act on. Look at polar bear. What are some adaptations a polar bear has? It has large feet to walk on the snow. It's white. Okay, the white fur helps it hide in the plain sight of the snow so it can get food. It has big muscular shoulders to catch prey, yada yada. All of these things are traits that this bear has accumulated over time that allows it to survive best in its habitat. That's natural selection. Look at this cute little guy, this fennel fox. Why does he have such big ears? How would that be an adaptation? How would that be a beneficial trait? Well, one, he hears better. He can hear prey or predators. But two, he lives in a very hot environment. The ears allow him to cool down easily. That's an adaptation that he has accumulated over time due to natural selection. The fennel foxes that had bigger ears survived longer and therefore had more babies. So the fennel foxes started to get bigger ears over time. Do you know that giraffes didn't always have big long necks like this? But why is a big long neck an adaptation? What is the good of that? Why would that be beneficial? Well, the giraffes with longer necks could reach the food that was higher up. That meant that they lived longer. That meant that they had more babies. So once again, having a long neck was an adaptation. It's just a genetic trait that they had that happened to give them an advantage that made them live longer and therefore have more babies over time, which is natural selection. Ooh, do you guys see this like moth thing? What does this kind of look like? Looks a little bit like owl eyes to me. And if I was just a little bird coming to get a snack and I see these eyes, I'm going to think, oh my gosh, it's an owl. Owls eat other little birds, so I would fly away. So that would scare me away. But I got down here. Do you guys see this wing inside? It looks like a snake. So not only does it have an owl-like appearance, but it even has a snake-like appearance, which if I was once again a predator coming to eat it and I see a little snake head, I'm going to hightail it out of there. So how did this happen? Somewhere along the line, one moth or a couple moths had this genetic trait to kind of look like these predators. That made them live longer. That made them have more babies. And this became the more common allele. All right, so keep in mind, adaptations are totally different for each environment, for each organism. If you try to put a penguin in the desert or a camel in the Arctic, most likely that would not work out because they are fit for their environment. So they are adapted to live with very little water because over time, the camels that could survive with very little water were the ones who had the most babies, etc. Okay, a pufferfish, it blows up and scares away the predator, which is a trait that they've accumulated over time. How? Well, somewhere along the line in their history, genetically, some individual had this trait, and he or she or they or whatever survived longer, had more babies, passed it on, and this is the trait now that pufferfish have. Mimicry, which is when a non-poisonous species, this butterfly, mimics or looks like this other species. Why would that be good adaptation? Because if I'm a bird and I eat the monarch butterfly, I throw it up, it's disgusting, I'll never eat it again. If I'm flying around looking for food and he looks like a monarch butterfly, I'm not going to eat him. Why is that an adaptation? Because somewhere along the line, the genetic differences in this species favored the butterflies that looked like the monarch butterflies. So that gave them an advantage. They live longer. They have more babies. You can watch this video about the cuckoo bird. Very crazy. There's another adaptation that you can look at. So to sum up kind of what we know about natural selection as a mechanism of evolution, we know that natural selection relies on a couple of things. Firstly, organisms need to have more babies than the environment can support. If everybody had enough food and everybody had enough space and everyone had enough water and there were always enough mates, it wouldn't matter who had an advantage because there was enough for everybody and everyone could live equally. Just not true. So firstly, there's not enough. Secondly, offspring have to vary in phenotype. Remember, we said phenotype is physical appearance. So there's got to be different traits. If everybody was 100% identical, then natural selection wouldn't happen either because there's no trait to favor. There's no adaptation. So we're different. That difference has to be due to alleles. If I dye my hair blue and all of a sudden blue-haired people don't catch the coronavirus, okay? It wouldn't matter because that's not my genetic trait, so I couldn't pass that on to my kids. So the variation has to be due to alleles so that we can pass on these genetic traits so that the allele frequencies will change over time. It can't be something superficial or that you accumulated in your life. Those alleles or those genetic differences have to make you more likely to survive. And the longer you survive, the more you reproduce. Over time, the individuals that have those helpful alleles, those good alleles, those beneficial alleles, they are going to survive longer, have more babies, and therefore they will become more common. And that's natural selection. So I have another video where you can watch. This is all going to be uploaded, so you can watch that. We would play a game called Handshake Murder. Oh, so much fun stuff that we can't do. So if I asked you this question, can natural selection act upon one single gene? Could I just have the gene for hair color evolve? No, a gene cannot evolve. Natural selection acts on the organism as a whole. So I survive and I have more babies and I pass on my genes, and then that changes my population over time. So keep in mind, you can't isolate one gene. We're still talking about the whole organism because that's who's going to survive and reproduce. So, for example, you can see natural selection in a way on this single gene trait. So here's my initial population of lizards. Let's pretend like we're in Pittsburgh here. 80% of these Pittsburgh lizards are orange, 10 is red, and 10% are black. But after 10 generations, there's no red. And after 20 generations, there's still no red, and black has gone up to 30, and orange brown has gone down to 70. And after 30 generations, orange has gone down to 40, and black is up to 60% of my population. What does that tell me? That tells me that what trait was the adaptation? What trait gave them some advantage? Black. Black clearly offered some advantage here because they're increasing. And for some reason, the orange brown ones had a disadvantage. Okay, so maybe they only go out at night and it's harder to find the black ones. I don't know. I'm making this up because it's fake. But this clearly was the adaptation that allowed these lizards to live longer, have more babies, and that's why their percentage of allele frequencies went up over time. Here's our conclusion. What do we know so far? We know that natural selection is a mechanism of evolution. If natural selection acts on a single gene trait, it's eventually going to lead to changes in the allele frequencies of a population and thus evolution, because that's what evolution is. It's changes in allele frequencies over time in a population that ultimately could lead to a new species evolving from an old one. So that's our conclusion. We know that evolution is that change in allele frequencies over time, and we know that natural selection is one of the ways that it can happen. That trait gives you an advantage, and that advantage makes you live longer, and the longer you live, the more babies you're going to have. And that is the process of natural selection leading to evolution.